Okay, I think we can start. As a Swiss citizen, I guess I have to be punctual. And anyway, my name is Didier Pecla. I'm very pleased to be here chairing this session. And thank you to Vanessa for organizing not just this session, but I believe the three panels or sessions that we are having today on Angola. And so we'll have three papers by three PhD students today on women criminals and soldiers in Angola. And the first is Vanessa Oliveira, who is a PhD student at York University. And we'll have the three papers in a row. Then we'll have comments from the discussant and a general discussion. 15 minutes for each paper.
Slideshow and then from the beginning.
This technology is just. Good morning, everyone. So first of all, I'd like to warn you that this is a work in progress that will be part of one of the chapters of my PhD dissertation. So your comments and feedback is welcome. The various roles of women in the history of Africa have, until recently, been largely neglected by scholars. According to Margaret Hayes, scholarly interest in African women prior to 1975 was limited to the study of queens, prostitutes, and peasants. The reasons for such neglect were many. Among them is the fact that many of the extant primary sources available to write African history were penned by foreigners, especially European men, which created an ethnocentric and male view of African societies. On the other hand, from decolonization to the mid-1970s, the frameworks which influenced the study of African history tended to neglect women and gender as categories of analysis. Over the last 4 decades or so, a growing number of scholars have not only developed new methodologies to reconstruct the historical roles of women in Africa, but have also highlighted the important roles of African women in activities as diverse as agricultural production, household work, and trade. This paper contributes to this scholarship by analyzing the role of free and enslaved women in supplying food for the multi-ethnic population of Luanda, the capital of the Portuguese colony of Angola, drawing upon registers of crops entering and leaving the terreiro público or public market, and on terms of guarantee which allowed free and enslaved women to enter retail trade. This paper argues that women represented an important parcel of food provisioners and vendors in the city. Luanda was the single most important Atlantic slave port until the end of the slave trade in the 1860s. About 1.2 million enslaved Africans were embarked there between 1710 and 1830 alone. Luanda counted 9,755 inhabitants in 1781. 57.2% of them were enslaved. During the time period under consideration in this paper, the main economic activity was the export trade in slaves. The Atlantic slave trade attracted a significant number of foreigners who passed through or lived in Luanda, as well as a temporary enslaved population waiting to be shipped through the Atlantic Ocean. Permanent and temporary residents and slave ships' crew needed to be fed, although droughts sometimes destroyed the crops and killed livestock. By the late 18th century, black and mulatto women in Luanda were key agents in the development of local and long-distance trade. Some women owned slaves, ships, commercial and rental house and arimus plantations, where crops were grown and cattle were raised to supply Luanda's markets. The most successful of these women received the title of donas or lady. The economic and social rules of women in Angola having been the subject of some scholarly interest. And here I need to mention the work of Professor José Curto, who presented in the previous panel, Mariana Candido, and Selma Pantoja. My own work draws upon these contributions in order to challenge the image of African women as victims of a political economy that reduced them to the positions of social submission and domestic reclusion. Luanda had 4 outdoor markets, where a variety of products could be found, such as vegetables, fruit, cassava flour, palm and peanut oils, and all kinds of fazendas secas and molhadas, which mean dry goods, spirits, and groceries. In 1769, Governor Dom Francisco Inocêncio de Souza Coutinho created a permanent market called the Terreiro Público. Coutinho's initiative was part of a series of measures which found its way through the 19th century in order to sanitize and civilize the city. The regiment of the Terreiro Público established that products entering and leaving the public market should be properly registered in books. These measures gave origin to a series of transaction books, which provide information such as the name of provisioners, origin of the products, quantity, buyer names, and dates of entry and sale. For the purpose of this paper, I will focus on food provisioners of 2 products, cassava flour and beans. Okay. The Terreiro Público received daily supplies of cassava flour coming from Bengo, Kwanza, Golungo, Dundee, Quilunda, and Brazil. The flour entered the markets in sacos or bags, which were properly weighed and registered. Between 1787 and 1790, 1,400 entries were recorded in the transaction books. Of these entries, 60% listed women as provisioners, while 94% listed men. Among the registers under male names, 54 were done on behalf of women who sold the cassava flour indirectly. In total, there were 89 women. Of those, 77 were Luso-African donors. Among the provisioners of cassava flour, Filipa, slave of Martinho Teixeira, supplied the market with 6 sacos in December 1789. The amount of flour she delivered was small when compared with other women, but even so, it illustrates that it was possible for a slave to produce and supply local markets. The beans entering the Terreiro Público came from plantations in Icolo, Dundee, Golungo, and Bengo. Of 810 registers done between January 1816 and December 1817, 8% were done under female names, while 92% were done under male names. However, 22 of the registers were made by men on behalf of women. For example, on January 1816, Captain Manuel de Queiroz Matos Regadas supplied the Terreiro Público with 18 sacos of beans on behalf of Cristina André. Of 51 female beans provisioners, only 7 were black, and still only 3 of them sold their own products directly. Only Maria Domingas and Gracia Paulo and Maria Fernandes Novaes supplied the market directly, with 42 sacos of beans. And Gracia Antônia, Violante João, and Gracia Domingas had the beans delivered and registered by males, while Antônia Violante supplied the market with 5 sacos of beans that belonged to a male, called Felix Gouveia. As these examples illustrate, some women supplied the market indirectly, passing the product they owned to another person, usually a man, who made the delivery and had the product registered under their names. Given that all the women had beans and cassava flour registered under their own names, there was no legal impediment for a woman to do so. The impediments, however, could be of another sort. The plantations were located in the margins of the rivers, and the crops were sent overland and by sea to Luanda, which meant that the provision owners had to pay the costs of transportation. A few of these women had their own vessel, on board of which they sent the crops to the city. But some women might not have the capital needed to cover the expenses of delivering and selling the products in the Terreiro Público, located in Luanda. Therefore, they chose to do so through an intermediary who certainly shared part of the final product. Many wealthy women in Luanda owned stores where they employed poor and enslaved women as vendors. Others sent their female slaves to sell products on the streets or in the outdoor markets. Retail trade was also one of the few opportunities open to poor women who are excluded from most of the skilled occupations. Facing narrow employment opportunities, they entered the retail trade as quitandeiras or street vendors, selling products in the outdoor markets and on the streets alongside enslaved women. Those interested in entering the retail trade in Luanda had to obtain authorization and license from the municipal council. In order to do so, they needed a guarantor who, by signing the bail, became responsible for any accusations made to the beneficiary. Of 763 terms of guarantee signed between 1784 and 1787, women were beneficiaries in 33.4% of them, while men appear as beneficiaries in 66.5%. Among the 255 women sponsored, only 12 were seeking authorization to open stores. All of them were free women with enough capital to have a store. The only exception was a free black woman called Maria Antonio. Her term of guarantee was signed by Luis Fernandes on October 1784. As a free black woman, Maria Antonia may have earned enough money as a quitandeira to allow her to open a store, even if it was a small possibility. On the other hand, the relationship between guarantor and beneficiary could have been a more intimate one. This fact may indicate that he had a special relationship with Maria Antonia. Of those 243 women who requested authorization to sell products in the outdoor markets, 90% intended to employ female slaves as quitandeiras. However, 98.6% were seeking authorization to engage in the retail trade themselves. They were poor mulatto women and free and enslaved black women. Of 64 women identified as black seeking authorization to sell products in the outdoor markets, only 20 were enslaved. All 12 stores in question specialized in fazendas molhadas, or spirits. The quitandeiras, on the other hand, sold different kinds of products, from dry good, spirits, groceries, glass beads, pork meat, and bread. Josefa dos Santos and Luiz Antônio Lobo, for instance, sold bread, pork meat, and spirits in the outdoor markets. The commercialization of these products followed very strict rules regarding wages and measures, which were regulated by the municipal council. The administration developed a dual relationship with street vendors. On the one hand, the work of street vendors were crucial to supply food for the population of the city, while, on the other hand, control of the outdoor retail trade by poor and enslaved women was always viewed as dangerous by authorities and store owners who faced competition. In conclusion, food production and retail trade might well have been an alternative for those who didn't have enough capital to enter the trade in slaves. Along or through the patronage of established entrepreneurs, free and enslaved women entered the retail trade in Luanda. In stores or in the outdoor markets, they offer a diversity of products, from groceries to durable goods that came from Luanda's hinterland and from abroad. Women who supply the public markets or active in retail trade compose a very diverse group. Alongside men, elite women supply the terreiro público, owned stores, and employed female slaves as street vendors. The production of crops required a great investment in land, labor, and transportation, which contributed to keep small female traders and enslaved women away. The majority of women acting in this business were donas, who owned plantations, labor, and sometimes even the means of transportation necessary to produce and deliver the crops that fed Luanda's population. As the data illustrates, it's likely that small female traders could only supply the terreiro público to the patronage of existing big traders. In the retail trader of the outdoor markets, however, poor and enslaved women who operated as street vendors predominated. The more democratic outdoor market business was one of the few opportunities available to poor women. There, they were better able to operate as independent small-scale traders, earn some profit, and, presumably, establish a measure of independence in relation to men. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also for being very precise about keeping the time. I'm very impressed. We now move to Tracy Lopez, who's also doing her PhD thesis at York University, and who will present a paper on crime, punishment, and the rise of a police state in 19th century Angola.
Okay, and thank you all for coming, and thank you as well, Vanessa, for organizing this. Okay. In 1681, a poet described Angola as, quote, a dunghill of Portugal where she purges her scum, end quote. The scum refers to the Portuguese convicts, or degradados, exported to Angola from 1446 to 1954. In Angola, their European background gave them an advantage, and many degradados held positions in the colonial administration. Since few white women immigrated to Angola, degradados maintained relationships with African women, resulting in the emergence of a Luso-African elite. Degradados represented a large portion of the white population, and yet many historians have only mentioned them in passing. Gerald Bender asserts that degradados posed a major threat to the peace and well-being of Africans and Europeans alike, and that, quote, the pre-20th century history of the Portuguese in Angola is essentially the history of exiled criminals who were dumped on Angola's shores like the garbage they were considered to be, end quote. Bender argues that degradados committed almost every crime imaginable, quote, from murder and counterfeiting to raping young orphan girls, end quote. He attributes this disorder to Portuguese penal policy and notes that while the British transported individuals convicted of minor offenses to Australia, the Portuguese transported rapists, arsonists, and murderers to Angola. Although scholars have since questioned the connection between penal colonization and crime, they have yet to explore crime and punishment within this context. The 19th century saw major economic changes as well as demographic growth, which are important for understanding crime and punishment. In 1836, under the initiative of Premier Marquês de Sá da Bandeira, the Portuguese colonial administration officially abolished the exportation of slaves overseas and transitioned the economy of Angola to legitimate commerce and agriculture. Jose C. Curto notes that Luanda's population more than doubled between 1844 and 1850 from about 5,600 to 12,500, since much of the population that would have gone through the slave trade was retained locally. Also in this period, there was an expansion in housing, public works, and the naval yard, which transformed Luanda into, quote, a coastal urban center, end quote. The colonial administration, anticipating a rise in crime, increased the police force, and in 1847, the then governor of Luanda, Pedro Alexandrinho de Cunha, introduced prison reforms in the Boletim Oficial do Governo da Província de Angola, which will now be referred to as BOA, which was Luanda's weekly gazette. The prison and the police became increasingly important in this time period. When David Livingstone visited in 1854, he described Luanda as, quote, a very considerable city in a state of decay, end quote, but noted that despite Luanda's decaying state, quote, it was provided with an effective police, end quote. Francisco Travassos Valdez, who visited the colonial capital in the early 1850s, commented on Luanda's, quote, good police force that was kept in excellent order by their chief, Major José Lourenço Marques, end quote. From 1857 to 1866, Lourenço Marques published police reports under the Parte da Polícia Ocorrências section of the BOA. To date, I have found 363 people imprisoned alone between 1857 and 1859. The Parte da Polícia Ocorrências section continued to publish imprisonments well into the late 1870s, and consequently, this number represents a small fraction of the total people taken to prison. Nonetheless, it highlights the way in which the police use the prison not to control the degradado population, but instead to control the slave population at a time of major political, economic, and social changes. The Cunha's governorship was marked by controversy. He became the governor of Angola on September 6, 1845, and was in power until 1848. Colonial scholars have remembered him as a far-seeing governor who suppressed the slave trade and promoted the development of agriculture. In his biography, Joaquim Duarte Silva called de Cunha an honest and strict humanitarian following the tradition of Sá da Bandeira. However, Joaquim Antônio de Carvalho e Menezes, who was evidently Pedro Alexandrinho's arch-enemy, painted a very different picture of the governor. Carvalho e Menezes was from a prominent family in Luanda and part of the Luso-African community. He made several recommendations to the metropolitan government, including clear divisions between civil and military powers, greater accountability for governors, changes to the convict system, and improvements in agriculture, commerce, and industry. In his work, he denounced de Cunha, calling him a tyrant and accusing him of turning a blind eye to the slave trade. He argued that the governor controlled through force and terror, and that under him people were wrongly imprisoned and deported. In 1847, de Cunha published his prison reforms in the BOA. The timing of this publication is highly reflective of the challenges that he faced during his government, but also broader changes in the 19th century. African societies did not practice penal servitude as a judiciary institution or establish prisons as a specific place for incarceration. Jan van Sina notes that in 1576, the Portuguese constructed the fortress of São Miguel in Luanda, which contained a prison, and shortly thereafter, the fortress of São Pedro do Penido. However, they served a subsidiary role, and by 1674 had fallen into disrepair. For much of Luanda's history, anyone sent to prison ended up in the fortress, dungeon, or simply a room in the barracks at a garrison post. Beyond that, such punishments were generally reserved for European and African elites that rebelled against the regime. However, the 19th century saw the emergence and exportation of the prison, as well as greater police control. De Cunha's prison reforms must be placed within this context, but also within that of an increasingly imperialist Portuguese state seeking to impose law and order. Douglas Wheeler argues that the 1836 to 1891 period was, quote, a distinct era in the history of Angola, end quote. It coincided with the rule of Sá da Bandeira and the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade, which encouraged the expansion of Portuguese power to control trade and interior markets. This period also saw attempts to colonize through the establishment of white settlements, particularly in Moçambique, which was considered to be one of the healthiest regions in Angola. To finance the state, the administration raised taxes and embarked on military expeditions to draw revenue. On October 18, 1844, the first year of the BOA's publication, Cunha wrote that there was an urgent need for prison inspection, reform, and upkeep, and called for the establishment of a commission to oversee police conduct and prison administration. However, reforms were not forthcoming, and in 1847, Cunha once again complained of the lack of police oversight. Finally, on June 19 and on June 26, 1847, he included a list of provisional regulations which addressed key problems regarding the current state of the public prison. These reforms provide insight into the mentality of the colonial administration, which was obsessed with surveillance, discipline, morality, and hygiene. They centralized power so that Cunha and the Secretary General had the authority to incarcerate prisoners as well as decide guilt and motive. Wardens were required to keep detailed records of their prisoners, including age, marital status, nationality, profession, distinguishing physical characteristics, and criminal background. Prisoners had to be divided by severity of crime, with serious offenders placed under greater surveillance and could not be released without the permission of the governor or the Secretary General. Prisoners were required to bathe on a regular basis, be clean-shaven, and fed twice a day. They were not allowed to have alcohol, gamble, or have visitors in the evening. Doctors had to inspect prisons daily and transport sick prisoners to the hospital. Cunha had a notoriously difficult relationship with convicts, particularly Arsenio Pompilio Pompeu do Carpo, and yet degradados are not mentioned in these reforms. Pompeu do Carpo was the most well-known and influential degradado. He was exiled to Angola in 1823 and rose in social rank from a soldier to a slave trader and finally president of Luanda's Municipal Council. He had become so influential that Carlos José Caldeira called him, quote, the dictator of Angola, end quote, after visiting the colony in the early 1850s. Cunha considered Pompeu do Carpo, quote, the colony's public enemy number one, end quote, and expelled him for bribery, embezzlement, and fraud. Pompeu do Carpo only returned in 1849 after Cunha had finished his term. Although the prison reforms do not mention degradados, they mention slaves, who, unlike degradados, did not command or did not always command significant political or economic power. These reforms were also published when slave owners' economic status was in jeopardy. In 1853, the government introduced a law that forbade slave owners from punishing their slaves. Then, in 1854, it introduced laws stipulating that all slaves had to be registered with the state and that non-registered slaves were automatically freed. Finally, in 1858, it decreed that slavery would be abolished within a 20-year period. Ironically, as the administration introduced legislations to abolish slavery, the prison reinforced, preserved, and reflected existing social and economic inequalities. The reforms stipulated that free individuals had to be separated from slaves, honest women from dishonest women, and black women from white women. Slave runaways were mentioned in the hygiene section, suggesting that the prison was used to hold and protect slave owners' claim to their human property, as well as control the slave population. It is difficult to determine whether these reforms were implemented, since the prison is virtually absent in travelers' accounts. However, the BOA illustrates that the number of imprisonments was high relative to Luanda's population. In a 2-year period, so from 1857 to 1859, 3,063 people were imprisoned, and the majority, 1,744, or 57%, were slaves. Europeans and Brazilians represented a minority with a total of 20 people, or 0.01%. Vancina, like Bender, argues that degradados contributed to the climate of violence and extreme disorder that had already been established by the slave trade, and yet the prisons were, quote, almost empty of Portuguese, end quote. Only one degradado was listed between 1857 and 1859. The majority of crimes in the BOA were property related, so human property as well included, which again further suggests that the prison and the police served to preserve the status quo as well as discipline the enslaved population. The high number of thefts, disorders, and violation of municipal laws likely reflects Luanda's transition to an urban city. The most common reason for imprisonment, however, was slave correction, meaning that enslaved people could be imprisoned at the request of their owners. There were also a number of restrictions on their mobility, and 429 enslaved people were arrested for not carrying passes. Lourenço Marques, the chief of police, addressed the high number of pass violations in the BOA on August 21, 1858, warning slave owners that if their slaves were to be out after 10 p.m., they needed to have proper documentation. Finally, the number of people imprisoned for violent crimes was relatively low, especially compared to the other crimes. However, the majority of victims were slaves, as you can see, and with the crimes that listed as well. Nonetheless, despite this risk of violence, slaves continued to resist their enslavement, evidenced by the high number of runaways in the prison. 416 people fled and were imprisoned from 1857 to 1859. To conclude, crime is an important theme in Angola's past. During the 19th century, Luanda experienced demographic and urban growth, which is crucial for understanding crime. The colonial administration, under the governor, Cunha, published prison regulations in the Weekly Gazette, which highlights the mentality of the colonial administration. Rather than use the prison to control convicts, many of whom were politically and economically powerful, it was used to control the slave population during a time when the Portuguese were cracking down on the slave trade and domestic slavery. This contradiction reflects a disconnect between the metropole and the colony. The Cunha, who colonial scholars compare to Sá da Bandeira, and the major chief of police used the prison not to protect the population from violence, but instead to protect the property interests of slave owners. Thank you.